In the spring of 2023, Michael and Dana Hill bought the late Betty White's beloved Brentwood home in Los Angeles. Tucked away in a quiet cul-de-sac near Sullivan Canyon, the house had been on the market for nearly a year following Betty's peaceful passing in her sleep on December 31, 2021. It was a modestly sized, 5-bedroom ranch-style house by celebrity standards charming, surrounded by old eucalyptus trees and bathed in golden California light. Betty had lived there for decades. It was where she spent her final years, far from the spotlight, watching game shows, feeding birds from her kitchen window, and sleeping beside photos of her late husband, Alan Ludden. Michael was a screenwriter with a couple of small TV credits, and Dana was a therapist. They had no children, only a rescue Labrador named Sunny. The house felt like a dream. It had a warm energy. The walls whispered of joy, of quiet laughter, and simple, timeless happiness. But less than a week after moving in, Dana began to notice strange details. The television in the guest room, never plugged in, would sometimes be on, always tuned to old game shows. Betty had once said she loved watching reruns of Password, the game show her husband hosted. Dana figured it was a faulty wire or her own forgetfulness. She brushed it off. Michael, meanwhile, started waking up at 3:15 a.m. every night. Not to noises, but to presence. Like someone standing at the bedroom door, watching. Each time, he'd turn on the light and find nothing but silence and the sleeping dog at his feet. But that silence began to change. 3 weeks after the move, Dana was making tea in the kitchen when she heard a whisper behind her. "Alan!" She froze, turned quickly, but no one was there. The sound had come from the sunroom. She went in, heart thumping, and found the door wide open, though she'd just closed it earlier that morning. That night, Dana told Michael what she'd heard. They both agreed it was odd, but maybe she'd been tired, or maybe the radio had been on. Then came the laughter. Soft, unmistakable laughter. High, bright, warm, distinctly female. Came from the back garden. They both heard it. Michael even stepped outside to see if a neighbor was entertaining guests. But the canyon was still and quiet. The laughter had come from inside. That same week, Sunny, their Labrador, began refusing to go near the den. He would stand in the hallway, ears low, tail down, staring toward the couch where Betty had once sat every evening with her cats. Sunny would growl lowly, the hair along his spine raised. They brought in a technician to check the wiring, the vents, the security system. Everything was fine. More than fine. Immaculate. Dana started waking to music. Just a few bars of a melody, vintage, soft, always fading before she could catch the lyrics. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Always around 2:30 in the morning. They no longer laughed about it. Something was in the house. They had avoided renovating the primary bedroom out of respect. That's where Betty had passed, peacefully in her sleep. The bed was gone, of course, but the room still felt inhabited. One afternoon, Dana decided to finally repaint it. As she moved furniture around, she found something stuck behind the built-in bookshelf. A yellowed envelope addressed to Alan, "In case you beat me there." Inside was a short, handwritten note from Betty. Loving, gentle, and full of wit. She'd written, "I'll find you wherever you are. And if you're not waiting for me, I'll just haunt the cats instead." Dana froze reading it. That night, Dana had her first dream about Betty White. She was standing in the sunroom, bathed in sunlight, wearing a pink cardigan and sipping tea. She looked at Dana and said, "I didn't mean to scare you. I just missed the noise." Dana awoke crying. Not from fear, but from grief. It wasn't hers. She could feel it. The longing, the loneliness. They tried to cleanse the house. A local spiritualist came, burning sage and reciting gentle prayers. The house responded with flickering lights, opening doors, and once, a wind that blew through the kitchen though no windows were open. But it wasn't evil. That's what the spiritualist said. This spirit doesn't want to leave. She's not stuck. She just doesn't like being forgotten. Michael went digging into interviews, old videos, anything he could find. Betty had often said she hated being alone. After Alan died in 1981, She never remarried. Her love for him never wavered. Her house had been her world. Her friends had died one by one. The birds, the TV, and the cats had filled the space. Now the space was filling itself. Dana left out a dish of water for the birds one evening. The next morning it was empty, not spilled, used. Tiny prints were in the soil near the porch. No birds had been seen. Michael started leaving the TV on at night, tuned to Game Show Network. The laughter and whispers stopped. They had honored her ritual and she seemed to approve. By late summer, the house was quiet again. Dana began practicing therapy from the sunroom, and her clients commented on the light, the peaceful energy, and the feeling that someone good had lived there. Sometimes, when they turned on the radio in the kitchen, it would skip to the 1950s big band station on its own. Sometimes, Sonny would bark once into the hallway, tail wagging, as though greeting someone familiar. And once, on Betty's birthday January 17th, they found a single white daisy on the windowsill. No one had brought it in. The windows had been locked. They never tried to make Betty leave again. "She's part of this place," Dana later told a reporter when word of the haunting made its way into an LA Times feature. "She's not hurting anyone. She's just still here. And honestly, it makes us feel safe." And for now, Brentwood's quiet street keeps its secret. The house of America's golden girl still smiles quietly behind its garden walls. And if you listen closely on a warm summer evening, you just might hear a familiar chuckle from the den. A laugh that refuses to be forgotten. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The sun had just begun to set behind the Santa Monica Mountains, casting that rich, golden hue across the Brentwood neighborhood that locals called the honey hour. It was the time of day Betty White had loved most. The trees around her old home massive, swaying eucalyptus and dense hedges of laurel caught the light like silk, and shadows stretched across the lawn in soft patterns that never seemed to stay the same. The house itself, single-story, low-slung, with its off-white stucco walls and shingle roof, looked like it belonged in a different decade. Quiet, timeless, suspended. Dana stood barefoot in the kitchen, staring out the window above the sink. A mug of chamomile tea warmed her hands, but her fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from something more subtle, like anticipation. The air inside the house had changed again. She couldn't describe it easily to friends or clients without sounding irrational. It wasn't cold, or heavy, or hostile. It was aware. The house watched. There was no malice. There never had been. But ever since she found Betty's letter to Alan, the presence in the house had grown more expressive. It no longer confined itself to whispers or the soft hum of television static. It made itself known in other, quieter ways, familiar perfumes with no source, locked doors left ajar, songs from another era drifting through the vents. The morning after discovering the letter, Dana had woken with the unmistakable scent of lavender talcum powder in the bedroom, light and powdery, just on the edge of perception. She had smelled it once before, years ago, when her grandmother died and she'd helped clean out her old apartment in Florida. It was the scent of someone who had loved being alive, someone who still loved being remembered. Michael, always the skeptic in their marriage, had grown silent over the last month. Not dismissive, just thoughtful. He'd taken to spending long hours in the den with a yellow notepad on his lap, scribbling story ideas, though most pages remained blank. Once, Dana caught him just sitting there, looking at the old fireplace with a kind of distant wonder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked gently. He glanced at her and smiled faintly. "Do you think she ever sits in here with me?" "Just watching." Dana said nothing, but in her mind, she remembered something the spiritualist had said weeks earlier. She's not stuck here. She just prefers not to leave. One night in late August, a thunderstorm rolled in from the coast, a rare event in Los Angeles. The rain was soft at first, more of a whisper than a downpour, but it filled the canyon air with electricity. Dana and Michael sat on the front porch with Sonny lying between them, watching the lightning flash across the sky. It was nearly 11 p.m. A loud snap echoed from inside the house. They both turned instinctively. It sounded like the front door slamming, but the door was wide open. Dana rose, walked slowly into the living room. There was nothing out of place, nothing obviously wrong. But the temperature had dropped. The air felt charged. She glanced down and saw small wet paw prints on the hardwood floor, too small to be Sunny's, and shaped like a cat's. They trailed from the front hallway to the edge of the den, where they simply stopped. Betty had owned several cats throughout her life. All rescues, all spoiled. Dana knelt and touched one of the paw prints. It was real, cold. A drop of water clung to her fingertip. She didn't scream. She didn't run. Something about it felt natural, like the house was remembering itself out loud. Over the next few days, the manifestations became more direct. The television in the guest room now turned on without fail at 2:30 a.m., always to an old black and white game show, always with the volume just low enough to make out the rhythm of applause. They stopped unplugging it. Seemed rude, somehow, like silencing someone mid-sentence. One morning, Michael found an empty teacup on the small patio table near the sunroom. Not one of theirs. It was vintage white ceramic with a faded rose pattern along the rim. Dana didn't even ask where he'd found it. They placed it in the glass front cabinet in the kitchen and never used it. The boundary between living and dead, between memory and presence, had grown paper-thin. Dana began keeping a journal, mostly to stay sane. She would sit in the sunroom each evening, writing with deliberate calm while the birds rustled in the hedges outside and the wind moved the curtains as if by breath. Her entries weren't dramatic, just observations, feelings. Something like, "There's a new weight on the steps tonight, but no sound. Just a kind of pressure, like someone waiting for their cue." Or, "It's not haunted in the way people think. She's not haunting us. She's haunting the silence." The most vivid moment came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, when Dana returned from work early and stepped into the house to find the piano playing. Just a few notes. Slow, hesitant, as if someone were testing the keys. The piano had come with the house. It was an old Baldwin upright that hadn't been tuned in years. Dana froze in the hallway, eyes wide. The melody was simple, nearly childlike. But it was undeniably real. And then it stopped. When she entered the room, there was nothing. No one. Just the piano bench, slightly pulled out, and the sense that something had wanted her to listen. She sat at the bench and rested her fingers on the keys. The last note played had been middle C. It still vibrated faintly, as if remembering the touch. She didn't mention it to Michael right away. By the end of September, Betty's presence had settled into a rhythm. There was no chaos, no terror. Just a sense of cohabitation, of something sharing the space, watching, perhaps guiding. Michael began writing again. Dana started sleeping deeper, dreamless and still. But every now and then, they would both wake at exactly 3:15 a.m. without cause. Sunny would sit at the foot of the bed, staring into the hallway, ears perked. And though they never saw her directly, both of them, in their own quiet hearts, knew Betty was still home, and she wasn't ready to say goodbye. The days grew shorter in October. Los Angeles doesn't feel fall the way the rest of the country does. No dramatic color shifts or crisp air that bites your cheeks, but in Brentwood, under the eucalyptus canopy, you could feel something turn. A stillness, pause in the world, as if even the birds took quieter flights. Dana noticed it first. The light in the house changed. It wasn't just the season, it was something else, subtler. The living room always filled with buttery sunlight around 4 p.m. But now, the corners seemed deeper, more shadowed. It wasn't sinister, not exactly. More like the light was receding, as if it were making room for something older. Something that had always been there, waiting patiently beneath the surface. Michael didn't notice at first. He was buried in a script, his first real studio pitch, and spent most of his time holed up in the den. The idea had come to him in a dream, he claimed. A widow haunted by the spirit of her husband, not out of vengeance or guilt, but out of love that had nowhere else to go. "I think she gave it to me," he said one evening, setting down his laptop with a half-smile. Dana, sitting cross-legged on the couch, raised an eyebrow. "She?" He nodded toward the hallway. "You know who." There was no need to speak the name. It felt unnecessary, disrespectful even. like calling a beloved teacher by their first name. Dana only smiled, but her hands fidgeted slightly around the spine of her journal. That night, she sat alone in the sunroom after Michael had gone to bed. The wind barely moved outside. The night was unusually silent, no distant freeway hum. No owls. No coyotes yipping in the hills. The kind of silence that carried expectation. Dana cleared her throat. It was the first time she'd spoken out loud to the empty room. "I know you're here," she said softly, her voice steady. "I think you mean well. I think you're lonely." The lamp flickered once. A single pulse. Dana's breath caught in her throat. "I don't want to change the house," she went on. "I promise. We won't tear it apart. We won't erase anything." Another flicker. This one longer. She could hear the subtle hum of the refrigerator down the hall and her own heartbeat in her ears. Dana hesitated, then added, "If there's something you want to say, I'll listen." But the silence returned, deep and unbroken, until the next morning. She found the note on the hallway floor folded neatly, with no envelope. At first, she thought Michael had left it for her. It was written in delicate cursive, slightly shaky, in a faded blue ink. "Don't change the garden. The Jays know where I live." Dana stood holding the paper for several minutes before she even sat down. The handwriting didn't match Michael's or hers. She searched the kitchen drawers and office cabinets for similar stationery, none matched. It looked old, very old. She brought it to Michael in the den. He stared at it, silent. "We're not imagining this," he said at last. "This is real, isn't it?" Dana nodded, slowly. That afternoon, she went to the back garden. She hadn't planned to touch it until spring, but she'd made a few plans for new hedges. Maybe a pergola, definitely different flowers. She ripped them all up. The next morning, the blue jays returned. Not one or two, but a whole noisy crowd of them, flitting between the lemon tree and the bird bath like they'd been summoned. Dana stood at the window and watched them for 10 full minutes, mesmerized. They weren't frightened. They moved with purpose, landing on the same low branches over and over, chirping in rhythmic pairs. Like a greeting, she whispered, "I see them." Michael began waking from vivid dreams, usually around 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, his chest tight. But he couldn't recall what the dreams were about, only that they left him shaken, as if he had been speaking to someone across a great, quiet divide. One night he woke crying. Dana turned over, alarmed. "What is it?" Michael sat up, gripping the edge of the bed. "She asked me to find something." "Who?" He looked at her, hollow-eyed. "I think it's Betty." He said the name quietly, respectfully. The room felt colder after he said it. The window pane shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and for a moment, they both looked toward the hallway, expecting to see her silhouette, short, delicate, leaning against the frame, watching. But there was nothing. Still, the feeling lingered. Michael started digging through the house records, permits, deeds, old listings. He made a call to the local library's historical archive and visited the county registrar. Dana watched him fall into it the way he did with his stories, obsessively, almost reverently. "Something's buried here," he muttered one night, spreading out old blueprints across the dining room table. "Look." He pointed to the original design sketch from 1952. There was a root cellar marked on the southeast corner of the property. "But that doesn't exist," Dana said. "There's nothing there now." Exactly. That weekend, they walked the perimeter of the backyard, looking for any sign of disturbed soil or a hidden entryway. Behind the hydrangeas near the fence line, they found it. A section of stone that sounded hollow when tapped. Michael pried it open with a crowbar. There, beneath years of overgrowth and mulch, was a narrow wooden trapdoor with rusted hinges and no handle. Sonny barked once, sharply, and then went silent. The trapdoor groaned as Michael lifted it, releasing a deep breath of stale, cool air from below. A wooden staircase descended into darkness. Dana hesitated at the edge while Sonny whimpered softly behind her, reluctant to follow. They went down slowly. The root cellar was small and dry, its stone walls lined with wooden shelves. Most were empty, save for a few dusty mason jars and an old oil lamp that still worked when Michael lit it. In the corner sat a cedar chest, aged but intact, with brass clasps dulled by time. Inside, they found a single photo album wrapped in yellowing tissue paper, a silk scarf scented faintly of roses, and a series of handwritten letters tied with ribbon. The letters weren't addressed to anyone famous, not Alan Ludden, not colleagues or fans, but to herself. Letters of reflection, of grief, of joy, pages upon pages of private thoughts, stories of her animals, memories of laughter, pain she never shared publicly. It was a secret archive of who Betty White truly was when no one was watching. Dana wept quietly as she read. At the very bottom of the chest lay a small velvet pouch. Inside was a locket containing 2 photos, one of a young Betty, smiling wide, and the other of a man neither of them recognized, a soft-eyed stranger from another life. On the back of the locket, engraved in tiny script, "I'll stay close, just in case the garden forgets." After that night, the house changed again. The temperature steadied. The lights stopped flickering. The television stayed off unless they turned it on. The blue jays still came, but less urgently. Dana placed the letters and locket in the sunroom cabinet, behind glass. A quiet shrine not to a ghost, but to a life lived deeply. And the feeling in the house that watchful presence began to fade. Not completely, but gently, like someone slowly backing out of the room, content. Betty White had never been stuck. She had simply been waiting to be remembered right. And now she was. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.